It was a calm, cool night in February like any other, and the crew of a United States warship slept peacefully or relaxed, waiting for the morning. The Caribbean Sea lapped at the ship's hull, and the tropical air was refreshing. Suddenly and without warning, the beautiful ship exploded, with shrapnel flying through the air and an enormous boom rousing the nearby city of Havana. But all anyone could wonder was, who was to blame? Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. USS Maine was designed out of fear and necessity. The Brazilian ship Riachuelo in 1883 was an absolute beast, with the head of the House of Naval Affairs Committee, Hillary A. Herbert, stating to Congress, quote, "If all this old navy of ours were drawn up in a battle array in mid-ocean and confronted by Riachuelo, it is doubtful whether a single vessel bearing the American flag would get to port." From this, a discussion among the Naval Advisory Board would reach a fever pitch. The fact was that the U.S. Navy couldn't hold a candle to any major European fleet. Not only this, but the US at the time was subscribed to the government policy of isolationism, so projecting naval forces abroad ran counter to this idea. Let's take a moment to look at isolationism for those unfamiliar with it and our younger audience members. Isolationism, in basic terms, is essentially the government policy where a country worries only about their own country and stays out of foreign policy. It is a political philosophy that opposes involvement in all foreign affairs, especially the wars of other countries. Isolationism advocates neutrality and opposes entanglement in military alliances. President George Washington, America's first president, was the first to propose isolationism, and it stuck with America until World War II, and the nation only became involved in conflicts that directly involved American interests until 1941. From that point on, as we know now, America is very active in foreign affairs. After the Riachuelo became a reality and the US was confronted with such a reality, the board began to finally plan for ships to protect the nation in 1884. The ships would have to fit within existing docks and have a shallow draft to enable them to be used in all major American ports and bases, and the maximum beam and length were a fixed unit as well. The maximum displacement would be about 7,000 tons. Finally, two 6,000-ton warships were approved in 1886. The designs were for the pre-dreadnought battleship USS Texas and the armored cruiser USS Maine. Maine had some prerequisites: a speed of at least 17 knots, a ram bow, a double bottom, and the ability to carry 2 torpedo boats. Not only this, but her armament specifications had to have 4 10-inch guns, 6 6-inch guns, various light weapons, and 4 torpedo tubes. It was stated that the main guns, quote, must afford heavy bow and stern fire. Her armor thickness and many other details were clearly laid out in her design, and USS Texas had her own specs she had to live up to. The winning design for USS Maine was drawn up by Theodore D. Wilson, a chief constructor for CNR and a member on the Naval Advisory Board in 1881. His design resembled that of Riachuelo, having the main gun turrets positioned out over the sides of the ship and echeloned. With that said, let's look at her specs. Due to the limits of American industry at this time, it would take 9 long years to build the Maine. She was built from 1888 to 1895 by the New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn. She was classified as an armored cruiser or second-class battleship, displacing 6,682 long tons. She was 324 feet and 4 inches long, had a beam of 57 feet wide, and a maximum draft of 22 feet and 6 inches deep. She was divided into 214 watertight compartments, and a centerline longitudinal watertight bulkhead separated the engines. A double bottom covered the hull only from the foremast to the aft end of the armored citadel, and she was fitted with a ram bow. She was more akin to a cruiser than a battleship, being long and narrow. Normally, that would mean she was faster than her contemporary USS Texas since she was wider. But because Maine's weight distribution was ill-balanced, she was considerably slower. Her main turrets were also awkwardly situated on a cutaway gun deck and were nearly underwater in foul weather. Because they were mounted toward both ends of the ship and away from her center of gravity, Maine tended to roll more in heavy seas. She and Texas were both seaworthy, but Texas's high hull and guns mounted on her main deck made her a drier ship to be on. Let's look at her armament. The two main gun turrets were sponsoned over the sides of the ship and echeloned to allow both to fire fore and aft, and this met the demand for heavy end-on fire in a ship-to-ship encounter, which also included ramming the enemy if need be. Unfortunately, this left more to be desired when firing broadside, which was a key element when employed in a battle line. To allow for partial broadside range, her superstructure was separated into 3 island structures. This allowed both turrets to fire cross-deck between the sections. Her guns included 2 twin 10-inch guns, 6 single 6-inch guns, 7 single 6-pounders, 4 single 1-pounder Hotchkiss guns, 4 single Driggs Schroeder 1-pounders, 4 45-70 Gatling guns, and 4 18-inch torpedo tubes. As for armor, she had 12-inch belt armor, deck armor that ranged from 2 to 3 inches depending upon placement, 8-inch armor plates on her turrets, 10-inch armor plates on her conning tower, and 6-inch armor plates on her bulkheads. Next, we look at her propulsion. Now, Maine was the first American capital ship for which its power plant was deemed as high of a priority as its fighting strength, so this engine setup is crucial. She had 2 inverted vertical triple expansion steam engines powered by 8 single-ended Scotch Marine boilers. All of this created 9,293 horsepower and turned 2 screws. During her sea trials, she failed to meet her contract speed of 17 knots, reaching just 16.45 knots. She could carry a maximum load of 896 long tons of coal in 20 bunkers, 10 on each side, and this was a very low capacity for Maine's rating, and this further limited her time at sea and her ability to run at flank speed when coal consumption increased drastically. Maine's overhanging turrets caused even more problems, as it prevented coaling at sea, except in absolutely still waters. Otherwise, the collier could be damaged, Maine could be damaged, or both. Maine also had 2 dynamos to power her searchlights and provide interior lighting. She had 2 smokestacks and 2 masts for military rigging, but canvas never touched this rigging. She was an incredibly unique ship, and we provide a unique approach to ships and their stories. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Okay, time to get into her career. Maine was launched on November 18, 1889, sponsored by Alice Tracy Wilmerding, the granddaughter of Navy Secretary Benjamin F. Tracy. At the christening, a photo shows Wilmerding striking the bow near the Plimsoll line depth of 13, which caused speculation that the ship was unlucky from the very beginning. Not long after the launch, a reporter wrote for Marine Engineer and Naval Architect magazine, quote, "It cannot be denied that the Navy of the United States is making rapid strides towards making a credible position among the navies of the world, and the launch of the new armored battleship Maine from the Brooklyn Navy Yard has added a most powerful unit to the United States fleet of turret ships." In his 1890 annual report to Congress, the Secretary of the Navy wrote, quote, "The Maine stands in a class by herself," and expected her to be commissioned by July 1892. A long 3-year delay would put her commissioning off until 1895. This was because the shipyard was waiting for nickel steel plates from Maine's armor. Bethlehem Steel promised the Navy 300 tons per month by December 1889 and ordered heavy castings and forging presses from the British firm of Armstrong Whitworth in 1886 to fulfill its contract. This equipment did not arrive until 1889, pushing back Bethlehem's timetable. In response to this, Navy Secretary Benjamin Tracy secured a second contractor, the newly expanded Homestead Mill of Carnegie, Phipps and Company. In November of 1890, Tracy and Andrew Carnegie signed a contract for Homestead to supply 6,000 tons of nickel steel. Finally, she was commissioned on September 17, 1895, under the command of Captain Arent S. Crowninshield. On November 5, 1895, she steamed off to Sandy Hook Bay, New Jersey. She stayed there for 2 days, then headed to Newport, Rhode Island for fitting out and test firing of her torpedoes. She took a trip to Portland, Maine, and later that month afterward she reported to the North Atlantic Squadron for operations, training maneuvers, and fleet exercises. Maine spent her active career with the North Atlantic Squadron, operating from Norfolk, Virginia, along with the east coast of the United States and the Caribbean. On April 10, 1897, Captain Charles Dwight Sigsbee relieved Captain Crowninshield as the master of the Maine, and that's all we really have on her career. Next, we get into her sinking. In January of 1898, Maine was sent from Key West, Florida, to Havana, Cuba, to protect American interests during the Cuban War of Independence. She arrived at 11 a.m. local time on January 25, 1898. She'd remain there through the rest of January and into early February with no incidents. Here's where it gets interesting. On the evening of February 15, 1898, most of Maine's crew was sleeping or resting in their quarters in the forward part of the ship, and the captain and most of the officers were in their quarters in the aft section of the ship. In total, there were 355 men aboard, 26 officers, 290 sailors, and 39 Marines. All seemed normal, and it was a calm, quiet February evening in Havana Harbor. Suddenly, at 9:40 p.m. on February 15, 1898, the Maine exploded without warning. Immediately, the forward third of the ship was obliterated, and the rest rapidly settled to the bottom of the harbor. Of the 355 men aboard, 261 died. 2 officers and 251 sailors and Marines were killed by the explosion or drowned in the partial sinking. 7 others were rescued but later died of their injuries. 1 officer later died of what was called cerebral affection, but we simply call it shock today. Shock is a life-threatening medical emergency that can lead to death if not treated immediately. It occurs when the body doesn't have enough blood flowing through it, which can cause a number of symptoms like low blood pressure, weak pulse, rapid breathing, decreased urination, and skin changes like cold, sweaty, bluish, pale, or ashen skin. It is caused by a number of things like uncontrolled bleeding, severe burns, spinal injury, heart muscle damage, allergic reaction, severe infection, and poisoning. The effects of shock are reversible in the early stages, but a delay in diagnosis and treatment can lead to irreversible changes and death. Of those who experience shock, 1 in 5 will die from it. Of the 94 survivors, only 16 were left unscathed, with 78 being injured in the explosion and subsequent sinking. Captain Sigsbee and most of the officers survived because their quarters were in the aft portion of the ship, and they were able to reach the surface safely. The American merchant steamship City of Washington aided in rescuing the survivors. Though later investigations would reveal that more than 5 long tons of powder charges for the vessel's 6 and 10-inch guns had detonated, causing the explosion, at the time it was immediately debated. 25th President of the United States, William McKinley, was roused by a frantic Francis W. Dickens who broke the news, calling it an accident. Commodore George Dewey, commander of the Asiatic Squadron, quote, feared at first she had been destroyed by the Spanish, which of course meant war, and I was getting ready for it when a later dispatch said it was an accident. The next to make a statement was an expert on ordnance and explosives, Navy Captain Philip R. Alger, and he posted a bulletin at the Navy Department the next day communicating that the explosion had been caused by a spontaneous fire in the coal bunkers, which isn't too far off from the real cause. However, Assistant Navy Secretary and later U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt wrote a letter protesting this statement, stating it was premature. He argued that Alger should not comment on an ongoing investigation, saying, quote, Mr. Alger cannot possibly know anything about the accident. All the best men in the department agree that, whether probable or not, it is certainly possible that the ship was blown up by a mine. Journalists made the situation so much worse by sensationalizing the whole ordeal. They employed tactics that would be later labeled as yellow journalism, which is the practice of American newspapers using eye-catching headlines and sensationalized exaggerations for increased sales. Both the New York Journal and the New York World greatly exaggerated and distorted much of the information they had, sometimes even fabricating things to fit their agendas. William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal actually announced a reward of $50,000, quote, for the conviction of the criminals who sent 258 American sailors to their deaths. While the New York World was not as lurid or as shrill as the Journal, it still was similarly overly dramatized, insisting consistently that Maine had been mined or bombed. Privately, Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World felt that, quote, nobody outside a lunatic asylum really believed that Spain had destroyed Maine. However, his newspaper insisted that Spain needed to atone for the loss of Maine, and the only way to do so was to grant Cuba complete independence. Many Americans already agitated from what had happened to the Maine were driven into hysteria. Hearst's sensationalized reporting generated much support for military action against the Spanish in Cuba regardless of their actual involvement in the Maine. He frequently would quote naval officers saying the explosion could not have been an on-board incident, and he quoted an, quote, officer in high authority as saying, quote, the idea that the catastrophe resulted from an internal accident is preposterous. In the first place, such a thing has never occurred before that I have ever heard of either in the British Navy or ours. Now we look at the impending Spanish-American War. Maine's explosion did not immediately result in declaration of war with Spain. However, the event created a very tense environment that sustained an atmosphere that greatly reduced the possibility of a peaceful solution. The Spanish investigation found that the explosion had been caused by a spontaneous combustion of her coal bunkers. However, the Sampson board ruled that the explosion had been caused by an external explosion from a torpedo. The explosion of Maine put a microscope on the crisis in Cuba, and the McKinley administration did not cite the explosion as a casus belli, which is an act or event that either provokes or is used to justify a war, but others already had their pitchforks and torches at the ready. Advocates of the war used the famous rallying cry we know today, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." The Spanish-American War would begin on April 21, 1898, 2 months after the loss of the Maine. We said to remember the Maine, but don't forget to become a YouTube member or patron either. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Okay, it's time to look at the investigations and the fate of the Maine moving forward. Okay, there are a lot of investigations that have happened over the years, and I'm going to very briefly summarize them for you. The first is the 1898 Del Perro and de Salas inquiry, or the Spanish inquiry. They identified the spontaneous combustion of the coal bunker, located adjacent to the munition stores in Maine, as the most likely cause of the explosion, as well as the possibility of other combustibles on board contributing to it. None of the typical things we see with a mine or underwater explosion, like a massive column of water shooting up or dead fish in the harbor, were seen, and munition stores usually don't explode when a ship is sunk by a mine. Next, we get into the 1898 Sampson Board's Court of Inquiry, which was the United States inquiry. After a long process hearing multiple witnesses and expert opinions, the inquiry came to the conclusion that the Maine had been sunk by a mine, which in turn caused the explosion of her forward magazines. They came to this conclusion based upon the fact that the majority of witnesses stated that they had heard 2 explosions, and that part of the keel was bent inward. They did not claim that Spain was directly responsible, but of course there's the assumption. After this is the 1911 Vreeland Board's Court of Inquiry. This one is interesting because of what they were able to accomplish as well as investigating. In 1910, finally a second American Court of Inquiry would ensue, and in doing so, they would also recover the bodies on board to bury them in U.S. soil. The Cuban government also wanted the wreck removed from Havana Harbor, so that probably played into this decision as well. On this Board of Inquiry, several of the members would be certified engineers, so this is already a better start. Beginning in December of 1910, a cofferdam was built around the wreck and water was removed, exposing the wreck by late 1911. Between November 20th and December 2nd, 1911, a court of inquiry led by Rear Admiral Charles E. Vreeland inspected the wreck, and they concluded that an external explosion had triggered the explosion of the magazines, and they also concluded that the bending of frame 18 was caused by the explosion of the magazines, not by the external explosion. After the investigation, the dead were buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and the hollow, intact portion of USS Maine was refloated and ceremoniously scuttled at sea on March 16, 1912. Next, we get into the 1974 Rickover investigation. Admiral Hyman Rickover became intrigued with the disaster and started a private investigation in 1974, using information from the 2 official U.S. inquiries, newspapers, personal papers, and information on the construction and ammunition of Maine. He concluded that the explosion was not caused by a mine and speculated that spontaneous combustion was most likely the cause, from coal in the bunker next to the magazine. After this, National Geographic took a swing at it in 1998. To commemorate 100 years after the sinking, they commissioned an analysis by Advanced Marine Enterprises, or AME. Unfortunately, the results reached were pretty inconclusive, and National Geographic reported that, quote, a fire in the coal bunker could have generated sufficient heat to touch off an explosion in the adjacent magazine, but on the other hand, computer analysis also shows that even a small, handmade mine could have penetrated the ship's hull and set off explosions within. The AME investigation noted that, quote, the size and location of the soil depression beneath the Maine is more readily explained by a mine explosion than by magazine explosions alone. They did also state that this was not, quote, definitive in proving that a mine was the cause of the sinking, but it did strengthen the case. There are numerous experts, including Rickover and several analysts at AME, that do not agree with this conclusion. And finally, the Discovery Channel took a crack at it in 2002 on an episode of Unsolved History called Death of the USS Maine. They used photographic evidence, naval experts, and archival information to argue that the cause of the explosion was a coal bunker fire, and it identified a weakness or gap in the bulkhead separating the coal and powder bunkers that allowed the fire to spread. There is one conspiracy that we will briefly cover, as it is the official conclusion in Cuba, and it is the theory that the U.S. sank the Maine. The Maine monument in Havana describes Maine sailors as, quote, victims sacrificed to the imperialist greed in its fervor to seize control of Cuba, and claims that American agents deliberately blew up the Maine. Interestingly enough, this might hold some water, but we'll never know for sure. Operation Northwoods was a series of proposals prepared by Pentagon officials for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1962, setting out a number of proposed false flag operations that could be blamed on the Cuban communists to gain more support against them. One of these suggested that a U.S. Navy ship be blown up in Guantanamo Bay deliberately, and it echoes that yellow journalism we saw earlier, with the phrase, a Remember the Maine incident, being attached to it. On October 18, 2000, the wreck of Maine was rediscovered in about 3,770 feet of water about 3 miles northeast of Havana Harbor by Advanced Digital Communications, an expedition company based in beautiful Toronto, Canada. Marine engineer Paulina Zalitsky and her team accidentally stumbled upon the Maine while working with Cuban scientists and oceanographers from the University of South Florida College of Marine Science to test underwater exploration technology. Upon discovering her, they really didn't believe it was the Maine, since she was found east of where she was reportedly scuttled, describing the wreck as the Square due to its boxy shape. Once they began to explore the ship with an ROV, they found that the hull had not been overly oxidized, allowing them to see all of the ship's structural parts. They confirmed the ship's identity both by looking at the designs of its doors, hatches, anchor chain, and propellers, and by identifying the telltale bulkhead that had been created when the bow was removed in 1912. Near the wreck, a boiler and debris field of coal was also identified. Though she wasn't really sunk by Spain as the sensationalized accounts would lead us to believe, USS Maine's sinking was still an enormous moment in history, one that has led to continued controversy all of these years later. Rest in peace to the victims of the Maine, and may we always remember them. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our episode on the fire and sinking of Sultana in the cards. Next week, we get into the story of John J. Harvey, an incredible fireboat in New York City that helped in the firefighting efforts during the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.